G'day mate, 40 here. Have you heard the news? According to the Washington Post, number of white people falls for first time. Oh my God. And then Axios says, America's white population set to shrink. This is why all my hair fell out. Wall Street Journal, America's white population shrank for the first time. We're talking shrank, Shrek. Who shrunk the whites? Honey, who shrunk the whites? Slate says, vast stretches of America are shrinking. Almost all of them voted for Trump. Oh my God, we need to panic. This is frightening. Absolutely scary. We're talking panic city. So one reason that I became disgusted with the dissident right is the lack of intellectual rigor. In all the 100 of dissident right essays and articles and YouTube videos and podcasts that I heard about the great replacement and how America's white population is shrinking, there was zero consideration that I ever heard on how the data is assembled. Like if you just take statement X and then you build your whole life around statement X without doing any investigation into what constitutes statement X, you're a moron, right? So that's just, well, let's call it first level thinking. So let's say the CDC says that, let's say the CDC says 610,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. Like the smart, intelligent, thoughtful person then has to ask, on what basis does the CDC say this? And the basis is on death certificates. Then the smart person has to ask, well, on what basis should we believe that death certificates are accurate? And are we overcounting or undercounting the number of COVID deaths? And there are good arguments in both ways, right? There are good arguments that we are overcounting the number of COVID deaths, and there are good arguments that we're dramatically undercounting. Now, as it seems to me, the academic consensus so far is that we're undercounting COVID deaths by a factor of 3. But when you hear that the number of whites is falling for the first time, then you have to ask, on what basis? What constitutes those statistics? How were they compiled? And there's just no, I haven't encountered any rigor in dissident right analysis. I just see in the dissident right and in all sorts of superficial forms of analysis, they just take something, some government statistic, and then treat it as God's honest truth. So did white life expectancy fall? Well, between which years and which years as compared to which other groups? But I am not prepared for a live stream right now on white life expectancy. But how the US Census misleads on race, an important op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today. A new diversity index and a subtle change in a question have resulted in an undercount of whites. Right, so the most common reaction to the release of the 2020 census is summed up in the headline, Census data show the number of white people fell. Honey, who shrunk the whites? And the data show the number of whites declining by 8.6%. And then you get a political projection on this, that while gerrymandering could benefit Republicans in 2022, the political future belongs to the Democratic Party, which commands large majorities among minorities. Well, number one, it is not ordained by heaven that Democrats will always command large majorities among minorities, because people have interests. And the Democratic coalition is composed of a whole bunch of groups who hate each other, and about the only thing they have in common is some skepticism and fear of white Christian America. So it's by no means commanded that the overwhelming majority of Asians or Latinos are always going to vote for the Democratic Party, right? So these census results are quite misleading. So America's white population didn't really shrink between 2010 and 2020. It may actually have grown. So about 3 out of the American Hispanic and Asian population in this country is actually declining because about 30% of Hispanics and Asians are intermarrying. And so 35% of third-generation Hispanics of mixed parentage no longer identify as Hispanic. 55% of third-generation Asian Americans no longer identify as Asian American. And of those among Americans of Hispanic origin who don't identify as Hispanic any longer, about 60% said they were seen by others as white. So the racial identity of Hispanics is especially confusing because the census asks Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin separately from race. So in the 2010 census, 53% of those who said they were of Hispanic origin checked off only white, which is a 58% increase from 2000. The rise in white Hispanics helped account for the increase in the number of whites between 2000 and 2010. Now, in the 2020 census, a mere 20% of Hispanics checked off only white. So why did it go from 53% of those who said they were Hispanic in 2010 saying they were only white to, in 2020, only 20% of Hispanics checking off only white? That's not reflecting real data on the ground. That has to do with how the census was presented. So the census changed how we question people about race. So in 2010, census asked respondents to check off whether they were white or black or African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Pacific Islander, or some other race. And that's it. 2020, the census asked respondents who checked off white to specify their nationality. Were they German, Irish, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, and no Spanish-speaking nationality was then listed. So this created the impression that Hispanics were another race, notwithstanding the previous question's disclaimer that Hispanic origins are not races. So yeah, Ricardo says what many people are now saying. I always put refuse to answer on racial surveys. What's Jennifer Rubin's problem? Why does she hate white people so much? I don't know. Isn't it weird how everyone seems to have to intermarry except for really dark people? Well, I don't know about that. I'm not prepared on that. But the way the census was presented this year, it caused a dramatic undercounting of whites. So you can't just take it as God's honest truth that the census says, oh, number of whites has dropped 8%. The number of whites may well have increased between 2010 and 2020. So social mobility, intermarriage, are weakening the distinction between Americans identified as white and those Americans identifying as Asian or Hispanic. So census projections that the US will become a majority and minority nation by 2045 are likely to prove false. So in 2020, the census introduced a diversity index, and it filtered out Hispanics who consider themselves white by creating a quasi-racial category of 57.8% non-Hispanic whites. So this is the percentage that most commentators reported as white. But at least half of Hispanics in the United States identify as white. So this number in the census eliminated the 20.3% of people of Hispanic origin who still checked off only white. So they weren't counted as white. So it's like the authors of the census were determined to fuel nativist fears that whites are being replaced and to fuel liberal hopes of growing minority-based democratic majority. So like many first and second generation Americans, Hispanics and Asians initially found a home in the Democratic Party, but later, like the Irish and the Poles, they've begun making their political choices on class, on interest, and on values. So if third, fourth, fifth generation Hispanics and Asians still vote Democratic, it won't be out of ethnic identification. And in the 2016 and 2020 elections, there was rising support among Asians and Hispanics for Donald Trump and other Republicans. Now, Black Americans have not followed this path. So Black Americans are less likely to intermarry than Asians or Hispanic, and when they do, their children are still overwhelmingly likely to identify as African American. So compared to all other groups, according to a 2015 Pew survey, mixed race African Americans are more likely to complain of racial discrimination. So Barack Obama had one parent who's white, one parent who's black, but he very strongly identified as black. And he had all sorts of sad stories to tell about how he faced racial discrimination. So Asians and Hispanics who intermarry are highly likely to enjoy a significantly higher standard of living than unmixed Hispanic and Asian couples. African Americans who marry whites have a standard of living just slightly higher than unmixed African American couples. So the census's diversity indexes and the use of terms like people of color suggest some dramatic commonality between African Americans, say, living in poverty on Chicago's South Side and the Indian American CEOs of Microsoft and Alphabet. Right? This may help with reapportionment and redistricting, but it does not exactly paint an accurate picture of America and its politics. And Eric Hoffman, author of the book White Shift, The Future of White Majority Countries, also has a column about this, August 24. So he says the idea of a great replacement, that white Americans and Europeans are purposefully being replaced through immigration, has obsessed many on the right. It's a fringe belief, but its concerns will be exacerbated by recent headlines, such as in the Washington Post, number of white people falls for the first time. So the Post article says the results of last year's census marked the first time the absolute number of people identified as white alone has shrunk since the census started being taken in 1790. Again, you have to ask, how was the census conducted? How were the questions phrased? We don't really have any strong reason to believe that the number of white people declined in America between 2010 and 2020. Do I ever think about my Chinese ancestors? I don't. I never think about my Chinese ancestors. So I am 15/16 Caucasian, overwhelmingly of English and Irish stock. I never think about my lone Chinese ancestor who was a merchant in Townsville, my great-great-great-grandfather, right? So when you're more than 90% in one category, you're not going to think very much about just a tiny percentage that has no effect on how you live your life. So the left was jubilant about these new census results. Michael Moore said this was the best day ever in US history. And Jennifer Rubin, gosh, this is fabulous news. Now we need to prevent minority white rule. And Tucker Carlson was condemning the left's gloating, but he claimed without any evidence the opioid crisis in white communities explained the decline. So this news will only confirm views held by people on the fringe right, that white decline is being orchestrated by globalist elites and will lead to dire consequences for white people and their children. So the number of Americans who consider themselves to be white has increased since 2010. Okay, white America is not shrinking. White Americans are not being racially supplanted. So when people believe that white Americans are being supplanted, then it tends to increased support for far-right politics. So this announcement may make the cultural left feel good, but the results on the ground will be largely of benefit to the Trumpist right and the populist right. So according to this new census, 5.1 million fewer non-Hispanics ticked their race as white alone in 2020, but that's just because of the way the census was conducted. So when you change the wording of a survey question, you alter the pattern of responses. So you can conduct a survey and a poll to get almost any response that you want just by changing the wording. So the 2020 version of the census was changed. It used to be the census offered a single tick box for white and black, but now people are asked to write in their group in a text box below, and 15% of black and white respondents did not write anything, or they wrote something that didn't make any sense. So Hispanic Americans were told for the first time in a census that Hispanic is not a race when they were asked to design theirs. So this prompted people to question their choice of which box to mark. They opted for a multiple race or other race category instead. Also, I think the politicization of white identity in the Trump era probably caused fewer people to identify as white than previous. It may well be that overall Trump was bad for white identity politics. So just like there are substantially more Anglos in America than people who identify as Anglo, because identifying as Anglo since about the 1915, 1920, 1930s has been considered boring, right? 1912 to 1920, out of Greenwich Village, New York City, that's when you had the rise of Anglo self-hatred. So you never had an Anglo self-hatred movement in the United States prior to about 1912, 1915 to 1920. But then you had this rise of this Anglo self-hatred movement, which essentially set the tone for racial identification that's still around today. And this tone is that the white majority should become cosmopolitan and lose its ethnic distinctiveness, while for minorities, it's wonderful if they retain their ethnic distinctiveness. So it's great for blacks and for Jews and for Mexican Americans and Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans to celebrate their unique heritage and to be obsessed with their unique heritage and to continue their unique heritage. But if white people have similar concerns about their heritage, then this is pathology. So it's wonderful when minorities do it. It's awful when the white majority does it. So this is thinking that developed out of Greenwich Village among Anglo-Saxons. It wasn't created by the Jews. This is by disaffected Anglo-Saxon intellectuals in the Greenwich Village between 1912 and 1920. So I did a previous video on the rise of Anglo self-hatred. So in Australia, you'll find all these stories about the first Aborigine neurosurgeon, or the first Aborigine president of an Orthodox synagogue. So there was some woman who was like a tiny part Aborigine who converted to Orthodox Judaism, became the president of a synagogue, I believe, in Sydney, and this gets celebrated, the first Aborigine president of an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. But it's a little bit like Elizabeth Warren. She may be 512th Cherokee, but that's what she pushes, right? Because that's the way you get affirmative action. So 8 in 10 Black Americans have substantial white backgrounds in their family history. So we've had a dramatic jump in the number of people who identify with being from 2 or more races. So America is becoming increasingly biracial. But biracial whites and Native Americans consider themselves white. And the assimilation process means that with each generation, fewer descendants of Hispanic and Asian immigrants identify with their Hispanic or Asian immigrant backgrounds. So it's impossible to conceive that the number of Americans considered white is actually in decline. So white Americans have maintained a Northern European fertility pattern with a total fertility rate between about 1.5 and 2. And this has stayed steady since the 1970s. So it's still below the 2.1 replacement level. So the unmixed number of white Americans will start to gradually decline in the decades ahead. But the big demographic story in 2010s was not about white Americans, but there was a huge drop in Hispanic fertility. There's also a substantial drop in Mexican fertility in Mexico. But American Hispanics, their fertility rate is increasingly converging with the white rate under 2. So yeah, the share of completely unmixed whites will probably dip below 50% by 2050, but the share of those who are considered white by wider society will still be around 70% or so of the population. And there's no indication that that's going to drop substantially below approximately 70% in the 21st century. So people's subjective racial identity is interesting, but we also need to know about the balance of objective racial categories. How do people regard you? Because how you're perceived is going to affect where you live, who you marry, who you vote for, and your life outcomes. So Richard Alba is an American sociologist of ethnicity, and he produced an important book, The Great Demographic Illusion, about this delusion that whites are just cratering and America is rapidly becoming a non-white country. So his important book, The Great Demographic Illusion, didn't get reviews because it doesn't fit the prevailing narrative. I remember when I was getting articles written about me all the time in 1998, but when people write an article about you, they always want to fit it within a narrative. So I'd be fit in the narrative of bloggers who are transforming their industry, right? So I noticed when journalists would write about me, they'd always want to fit it into some wider narrative. And if you can't fit someone into a wider narrative, then you don't do the story. So Richard Alba, sociologist of ethnicity, produced an important book, The Great Demographic Illusion, discussing in depth everything that I've just talked about, but the book doesn't get reviews, it doesn't get media coverage because it does not fit the prevailing narrative. So the media love demographic stories that America is becoming non-white because that's interesting. And all this hysteria is heightening the perceptions of grave threats to white people, which gratifies progressives. At the same time, it's going to substantially increase support for Donald Trump type populism. So the definition of white may blur around the edges. That's Eric Kaufman, but the white American majority is not going anywhere. Bye-bye.